The Fenestrae Server Administrator is the primary administrative interface for Faxination. It's the launching point for all of the Faxination host and device connector configurators, as well as tools such as the Address Manager, Cover Sheet Editor, and Queue Manager. You can launch the Fenestrae Server Administrator from the Fenestrae folder in the Start menu or by running admin.exe in the Fenestrae Tools folder. We've already gone through all of the device and host connectors, so let's move on to the server configuration itself. First is the logging ID for this kernel. The logging ID is useful when multiple Faxination servers or multiple kernel nodes in a load-balanced cluster are logging to the same SQL resource. The logging ID is included in the Faxination log by default. So by setting a different logging ID for each kernel, you can determine which kernel or server processed a message. This is helpful when trying to troubleshoot an intermittent issue that's kernel-specific. The identifier is how the kernel machine is referred to in all of the host and device connector contracts. The phone number format includes the international prefix and country code of the server. As we learned earlier in the training, setting the international prefix is crucial when your users are sending to Outlook Business Fax contacts, which includes the plus symbol as a stand-in for the international access code. Under Miscellaneous, we can configure how new Faxination database users are handled by default. When an unknown non-Active Directory user sends through Faxination for the first time, they are automatically added to the Faxination user database. This setting determines if they are added to the database with or without permissions. When this option is checked, new users are added, but they will receive a non-delivery report indicating no permissions. You can set the time interval in seconds between administrative checks. This includes checking the Faxination queue for jobs that can be bundled, deleting expired backup files, etc. And you can create backup files of all inbound and outbound messages processed by Faxination. These files are stored locally in the kernel in and kernel out folders by default. You can set the number of days to retain the backup files and the file format. If this option is enabled but 0 days specified, this is a special configuration which tells the kernel that the backups never expire. In high-volume environments, or when the backup folders are located on a small partition, take care that the backup files do not fill up the hard drive. That condition will disable the server. On the Fax tab, we can set the options that are specific to fax messaging. Attempts is the number of times the Faxination server will try to deliver an outbound fax message. Fenestrae recommends a maximum of 5 attempts, just in case the fax number is incorrect and you're actually calling someone's mobile or landline. There may also be laws in your area regarding autodialers. The delay in seconds is the amount of time the server will wait between the retry attempts. 60 seconds is a good minimum value. When the number is busy, the combination of 5 retry attempts with a 60-second delay is usually sufficient for the number to become available again. You may safely increase this value, although it will take longer for the sending user to receive a non-delivery report for a bad number. You can set the server behavior when multiple outbound faxes are queued for the same number. You can choose to bundle the queued faxes into a single transmission. This improves efficiency by avoiding the dialing and handshaking process between each fax, and the cover sheets will delineate the individual faxes on the recipient side. When bundling is disabled, you can set the maximum number of lines that can be used for a single outbound number. This defaults to 1, and this setting prevents subsequent faxes from failing due to busy signals when the receiving device is a traditional single-line fax machine. You may also enable a secondary call log that is independent of the main Faxination log, and inbound and outbound call logging may be enabled independently. Entries will be written to the Fen call log table in the Fen Messaging SQL database, and SQL tools may be used to view the data. Fenestrae does not provide an interface to the Fen call log at this time. SMS messaging is very different from faxing, and the retry attempts are really not applicable. However, you can set the maximum SMS message size at the kernel level. 640 bytes is equal to 4 160 non-Unicode characters and is the default. Outbound SMS messages larger than the maximum size will be rejected. Because MMS messaging requires an MMSC internet-based service, you may or may not have a need for retries. Ask your MMS service provider if this setting is applicable in your environment. The Directories tab defines the locations of the Faxination working data. In single server environments, there's really no advantage to change these from the defaults. But if you have multiple Faxination servers, active-passive clustering, or load-balanced kernels, it's useful to point all of the servers to the same data, preferably on a high-availability file server. This is most useful for the templates folder where the cover sheets are stored. The Notifications tab allows you to customize the subject lines of inbound messages and notifications per message type. Each field is a combination of literal text and Faxination variables, and these may be customized for your language or specific preferences. Mail templates may be customized per user. The Mail template mode selects the behavior to use when the template specified for a user cannot be found. On the Messages tab, first we can set the identifier to use for scan routing. Scan routing is used exclusively for the inbound routing of SMS messages and is based on a trigger word in the message text. The default identifier is TO:. The word that follows the identifier will be used for inbound routing and matched to the scan route of a Faxination user entity. Because you typically have no control over the content of an inbound SMS message, this feature has limited use in most environments. But when you do have control over the inbound SMS message, such as we saw with the vending machine scenario earlier in the training, this feature can be useful. HTML body support controls how the message bodies of outbound fax messages are rendered by Faxination. When enabled, which is the default, HTML message bodies are rendered to a separate page and transmitted after the cover sheet. Forced service routing can be used to print a copy of all inbound fax messages, regardless of the inbound recipient. The Print Outgoing Message option is the equivalent feature for outbound messages. When enabled, supply the UNC path to the printer and ensure the Faxination service account has the necessary permissions to print. Under bulk jobs, you can choose to adjust the message priority when a single message is being sent to multiple recipients, based on a threshold. In this example, when a single message has 50 or more recipients, the message priority for all of the messages will be set to low. Low priority messages will stay at the bottom of the Faxination queue and will only be transmitted once the normal and high priority messages have been processed. On the IP Filtering tab, you can limit incoming connector connection requests to specific IP addresses or ranges. The Connector Contracts tab lists all of the local and remote host and device connectors that are allowed to make a connection to the Faxination kernel, and allows you to view and edit the kernel side of the contracts. The contracts are created automatically during installation and during add-remove operations. In most cases, you will not need to edit the connector contracts manually. However, there is a monitoring option available here for each host and device connector. When enabled, unresponsive connectors will generate warnings in the operating system event log. Monitoring software such as SCOM or Tivoli can be used to create administrative alerts based on these warnings. The monitor timeouts for this feature are configured on the Advanced tab, which we'll look at next. The Advanced tab allows you to tweak the performance of your Faxination server by adjusting the processor threads that are dedicated for specific operations. For example, if your Faxination server is inbound only, you could set these fields to 411 for a slight increase in performance. The processor thread should never be reduced to 0. The timeouts are for the monitoring feature that we saw in the previous tab. By default, an alert will be triggered if a host or device connector fails to start within 300 seconds, or if a running host or device connector fails to respond to an alive request within 120 seconds. The Monitoring tab allows you to configure the location of the file that is used to store the additional monitoring options featured in the Faxination Management Portal. The Management Portal and its monitoring options are discussed in another video. The Data Sources tab allows you to configure the data sources and tables used by Faxination. The default data source is an instance of SQL or SQL Express and a database called Sms Messaging. These settings are populated automatically during installation and do not need to be modified in most cases. The credentials can be left blank when the Faxination service account is the DB owner of the database. The Logging tab allows you to configure one or more log stores. Logging to the Sms Messaging SQL database to a table called log is configured and enabled by default. Logging to SharePoint and other repositories can also be configured here. The logging of inbound and outbound messages can be enabled independently. Logging intermediate records will record each attempt to deliver a message. When disabled, only the final disposition of a message is logged, regardless of the number of attempts. And finally, when an inbound message is matched to more than one recipient, you can choose to create a log entry for each recipient. Otherwise, only one log entry will be created. The Traffic tab is where you configure the Fenestrae limits feature. This is a way to restrict the quantity of Faxination messages that your users can send in a specific period of time, which we discussed in our message flow video in Part 3. The restrictions can be configured per message type and must be enabled globally before per-user limitations will be enforced. In this example, the global setting is 30 fax messages per day. When a Faxination user has specific messaging limits defined, those settings will take precedence over the global settings. You can also set the maximum period of time that can be used to evaluate per-user limits. The Custom Routing tab allows you to set the database that is used to store extended custom routing rules. Extended custom routing is a legacy feature which originally stored routing rules in an Exchange public folder, but they are now stored in a table in the Sms Messaging database by default. The interface to create and maintain ECR rules can be found in the Faxination Management Portal. Note that extended custom routing is a deprecated feature that is retained in the product for legacy Faxination customers only. Generally speaking, it should not be used by new customers. The Digital Signature tab allows you to configure digital signing via a third-party signature service. When enabled and configured, it adds authentication data to cover sheets. Faxination 2016 supports Ccrypt DigiSeal servers only. The Connections tab allows you to configure the secure and non-secure ports where the kernel will listen for connections coming from the host and device connectors, and some HTTP-specific settings for session cleanup and timeouts. The number of processor threads to dedicate to HTTP communications, and the authentication method to use when SSL encryption between the kernel and the connectors is enabled.